practice both in a very enthusiastic way. That people in one group are also involved in the other and vice versa.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the host and the senior publishing director at Word on Fire. Many Catholics are concerned with the liturgy, while many others are concerned with social justice, and they're often at odds with each other. So how can we bridge this divide? That's what we'll be discussing today with Bishop Robert Barron, who joins us from his diocese of Winona, Rochester. Bishop, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon. Always a joy to see you.
I got to see you in person a few times, actually, within the
past
couple weeks.
In three different states.
That's right, in Florida and Minnesota, but then the other one was
Texas.
in Texas. And that's what I wanted to talk with you about. About half of the Word on Fire team traveled to Texas to put on the first inaugural Wonder Conference. This was a conference focusing on faith and science. It will be the first of an annual series, so we've already started working on the 2023 edition of the conference, 2024, I believe. But tell us, how'd that Wonder Conference go from your perspective?
I loved it. As part of the Templeton grant, we got this grant some years ago to do a number of things, and one was to have a national conference. And we invited some marvelous people, the great Father Spitzer, who's done wonderful work on religion and science, Karen Oberg, who's from Harvard University. I ran into her in Rome in September when I was there at the Pontifical Council for the Sciences. I gave a talk on faith, science, religion, philosophy, all that. I loved it. We had well over 1,000 people, and we sold out very quickly. And wonderful kind of buzz from the community, great interest in the talks, I thought. So the whole thing was wonderful.
I want to encourage people, if you weren't able to attend in person, we did record all of the talks, and they're available inside of the Word on Fire Institute. So if you've been waiting for a while to join, now is as good a time as any, because you not only get access to all the courses, the films, you get the Evangelization and Culture Journal that we produce, but you also get access to all of these talks from the Wonder Conference. So learn more, sign up at wordonfire.institute. That's the website. All right, let's talk about the liturgy and social justice, Bishop. Most observant Catholics are aware that there are several camps within the broader church. Some Catholics focus primarily on prayer and spirituality. Others focus on service to the poor and the homeless. Some participate in pro-life work, and others on immigration, racism, the environment. Now, many times these camps are held in tension with one another. You have groups opposing one another, getting angry at one another, fueling animosity. But perhaps none more so than these two groups, people concerned with the liturgy and people concerned with social justice. So maybe we'll start by asking you, has this always been your experience throughout your life? Have you always seen tension in these two camps, or is it more of a recent phenomenon?
No, I would say most of my lifetime, because I come of age right after Vatican II, and I think the split between the two happened in the years after the council. Like a lot of negative things, frankly, not because of the council, but in the wake of the council, that divide. So there are some people that are, fussing around in sanctuaries and with cassocks and surplices and candles and all that, and then other people out there on the street serving the poor. And they often would fall into opposing, as you say, camps. And I think that was in some ways, it's a bitter fruit of that time. Because I want to argue, prior to the council, and indeed in the texts of the council, the coming together of those two things is what's emphasized. And I think the loss of that has been a real negative in the life of the church. So I'd say, most of my lifetime I've seen that tension. Can I say something before I forget, Brandon, too? As you mentioned at the outset, these different, areas of interest. Well, nothing wrong with that. The people by nature, by background, by personality, by predilection will tend in one direction or the other. So a lot of my life in the church was spent in academia with books and ideas and teaching and writing and preaching, and fine. That's what I was, interested in. I was good at it, so I did it. Other people will gravitate in different directions. Fine. Nothing wrong with that. I mean, let all these different forms of life flourish within the church. The danger is when we start saying, okay, I've got it. I've got the right way to do it, and you should, you're not doing it right. So there's a legitimate pluralism in the way that we live our lives within the church. That goes back to the Pauline letters. That some are apostles, some are prophets, some are teachers, some are administrators. Fine, that's good and healthy. The warfare is not healthy.
It's easy just to give lip service to solving these tensions and just to tell these camps, hey, can we all just get along? We're all on the same team. We're all Catholic. But I thought for this episode, in order to chart a helpful way forward, that we could look at a few key figures who in their very person burst this false dichotomy, who were deeply passionate about both the liturgy and the social doctrine of the church. And the first one I want to talk about is a figure who's very important to you. I think people listening to you over the years have heard his name many, many times, but we've never done a dedicated feature about him. So let's do it now. His name is Monsignor Reynold Hillenbrand, not to be confused with Dietrich von Hildebrand,
right.
But Reynold von Hillenbrand. He was a figure in the early 20th century, someone who was involved in both the liturgical movement and social justice. Tell us a little bit about him and specifically how he linked these two dimensions of the church.
Yeah, a fascinating figure. As you say, a hero of mine. When I was rector at Mundelein, I had a portrait of him up in my office because he was my predecessor as rector of Mundelein Seminary. He was back in the 30s and early 1940s. Hillenbrand was a Chicago priest. The name gives away his German ethnic background, and that gave him a natural entree into both liturgy and all the reform movements before the council, because a lot of German thinkers were key there. Goes to Mundelein Seminary, and brilliant man, eventually sent to Europe for further studies. And then as a very young man, I think he was 31, he became rector of the seminary. So Cardinal Mundelein would have noticed his great gifts and put him there. In that capacity, he trained a generation of Chicago priests who sort of carried his vision forward and who still have influence. And I think we'll get back to this, but one of his students, Monsignor Bill Quinn, was a great mentor to me. So I would see myself spiritually as a kind of grandson of Reynold Hillenbrand. What were his great themes? I would say what you're talking about. The coming together of a passion for the liturgy of the church and for the social action work of the church. Hillenbrand saw the one flowing from the other, each returning to the other, each being fed and informed by the other. What happens around the altar has implications for our commitment to love within the wider society. What we experience in our work for justice returns now to the altar and is offered as a sacrifice to God. Now he was getting all that from the great liturgical movement leaders, people like Romano Guardini in Europe, Virgil Michael in our country, or Virgil Michael rather is from our country, from Collegeville, Karl Adam over in Germany. Those were the figures that impacted Hillenbrand, who then impacted a whole generation, not just of Chicago priests, but through the liturgical movement in our country, a whole generation of priests all over America. Maybe we'll get there next, but after Vatican II, his life took an interesting turn, and that's one reason why I think he's not as well known as he should be.
We'll say more about that. So Hillenbrand is this bridge figure who was active before and after the council in many ways, but what happened? What shifted during that period?
Well, from his perspective, nothing significant shifted, but from the perspective of others, something did. Here's what I'm talking about. In the 30s and 40s, he would have identified himself as a papal man because the popes, think of Quadragesimo Anno and think of Mater et Magistra of John the 23rd, think of the great social teaching encyclicals. That's what inspired him. It was the papal teaching of that period that was very strong on the works of justice. Now, after the council, 1968, this famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, encyclical of Pope Paul VI, Humanae Vitae, about contraception, which divided the church, still is a polarizing document. You got me, not Dietrich von Hildebrand, Reynold Hillenbrand supported it. And a lot of his followers, people that were very influenced by him and inspired by him in the 1940s, broke with him and thought, the old man's lost it. That he's become an arch conservative. And Hillenbrand's answer was, no, I was a papal man in the 40s. I'm a papal man in the 60s. And in fact, there's a link between the great social justice insistence back in the 40s and the teaching of Humanae Vitae. And so he paid a high price because Humanae Vitae comes out, 68? I think Hillenbrand dies in 78 or 79. The last, so roughly 10 years of his life, he was kind of a marginalized figure. Even his followers thought he was suspicious. And he died, I think, a bit under the cloud of that. But I see him now as a hero, as a model of how we can think through these things together in a very integrated way.
One of the ways that he did think through these things together is through the concept of deification, which was maybe the single most important idea in his writings and thought. Talk about that.
Maybe I've told this story, Brandon, on our show. I don't remember, but someone who was very much part of that movement, liturgical movement, all that back in the 40s and 50s, was Godfrey Diekmann, another German name. Godfrey was a monk at St. John's, Collegeville, not far from where I'm broadcasting these words. And, marvelous figure. He taught the church fathers for many years, and he was at Vatican II. He was influential in the writing of some of the documents. And I met him when he was a very old man through a mutual friend. We'll get to him, Monsignor Bill Quinn, who was a student of Hillenbrand. Well, anyway, I meet him as a very old man, and he marvelous storyteller and knew everybody, so I was fascinated by him. And I said to him, Godfrey, if you were young again and you could mount the barricades, what would you fight for in the life of the church? And he brought his cane. He's an old man, he was in his 90s, brought the cane down on my knee, and he said, deification. And that's the idea that Reynold Hillenbrand found so compelling. And they all got it from the liturgical movement people in the early 20th century. This is the mystical body theology that says the ordinary goal of the Christian life is what Aquinas called deificatio, becoming conformed to the divine nature, not just being a good person or not just being ethically upright, but being conformed to God's nature. How's it happen? It happens in the liturgy. It happens in the sacraments, especially in the Eucharist. Now, what do deified people do? They go out and live in the world in this radically transformative way. See, so that's why deification is a central idea that links liturgy and justice. Well, it was wonderful. I think of it now. Godfrey has gone to the Lord, of course. And I was there with Bill Quinn at the time, these two kind of venerable figures, both of whom would have known Hillenbrand very well. And I was a young guy at the time. I was probably 27. I was a newly ordained priest. But it linked me to that great tradition. And anyone that's followed me as I'm talking through these things, what are you hearing? What I've been teaching now for the past 25 years in my books and articles and these videos and so on, is I was caught up in that wonderful vision. You know who else was? Josef Ratzinger. You know who else was? Karl Wojtyła. You know who else was? Hans Urs von Balthasar. You know who else was? Dietrich von Hildebrand, if you want. All those people were part of this grand movement. And I think, maybe we'll get there, Brandon, but it's threatened from both sides today. It's threatened from the left and from the right. But I think it's the richest way to articulate the teaching and the practice of the church.
This theological movement with some of the figures you just mentioned, Balthasar, Hildebrand, Ratzinger, Wojtyła, we could also add de Lubac, Guardini to that mix. Guardini, they're characterized by the Communio school.
Yeah.
I want to ask specifically about the Communio ecclesiology, the Communio way of understanding the church, and how that itself can be a link between the liturgy and justice, the social action of the church.
Yeah, the deepest ground of a Communio ecclesiology, of course, is the communio of the divine persons. So the three persons of the Trinity exist in this perichoresis, the Greeks call it, this sort of sitting together, the circumcessio, if you put it in Latin. But it's the communio, the one in the other, of the Trinitarian persons that becomes the foundation of ecclesial life, because we've been invited, deification, into a share in that communio. Furthermore, it manifests itself in the communio of the church. So think of all the different elements in the life of the church, the different ranks and orders and different ways of participating in the mystical body, all of which are on display in the liturgy. Let me say a word about that, because I remember Cardinal George, again, someone very much influenced by this whole tradition. He used to say, the trouble is we read the liturgy in its variegated expression through Nietzschean lenses. So right away we say, oh, power relationship, who's on top, who's bossing people around, and how come I don't get up there to that position? Where he said, don't read it through Nietzschean lens, read it through this Communio lens, is the church is on its integrated, mutually implicative display at the liturgy. Cardinal George, again, he would chide priests who would sometimes, so I'll come to the liturgy, but if I'm not saying the Mass, I'm just going to sit in the back in my civilian clothes, And he would say, no. The priest always appears at the liturgy as head, because that's your job as priest. Now, don't read it in a Nietzschean way, like, I'm here to boss you all around. It means the symbolic display appropriate to a priest at the liturgy is as the head of the community. But look, everybody at the liturgy, everyone is displaying his or her proper role in the mystical body. And mystical body theology, all the different elements that make up your body, okay, they all have a wonderful function. They're all integrated one with the others. That's the sort of organic understanding of the church that's part of Communio. Do you want to do another step? We could do a show on this sometime. Go back to the Tübingen school, back early 19th century. Someone like Johann Adam Müller, who's one of my theological heroes. He dies at the age of 42, young man, but had a huge impact. He shifted from a more juridical understanding of church to a more organic understanding of church. Read him and now read Guardini, early 20th century, and then read Sacrosanctum Concilium, read Lumen Gentium. There's a direct line from the Tübingen thought of like Johann Adam Müller right through Guardini and people like Reynold Hillenbrand and others right up to Vatican II. That's the tradition that I'm standing in. And it's all conditioned by a Communio sensibility.
I love how a few moments ago you described the purpose of the Mass as deification. We go to Mass to become conformed to the likeness of Christ, and that in turn propels us out into the social mission of the church.
Right.
I think of two people that are very important to me, and I know to you as well, Mother Teresa and Pier Giorgio Frassati. Both of them demonstrated this same pattern of being people deeply devoted to the liturgy and especially to the Eucharist. So Mother Teresa and her sisters have daily Mass, daily holy hour of adoration before they do their social work. Same with Pier Giorgio, adoration, sacraments all the time. But it was going to the sacraments that for them helped them to see Christ in the poor. To me, that's always been the most important link, that the seeing Christ in the Blessed Sacrament enables you to more effectively see and serve him in the poor.
Right, that's the instinct. And see, if you have let's say all the liturgical stuff and benedictions and Blessed Sacrament, adoration, all that, without a commitment to changing and transfiguring the world, religion becomes more of an abstraction. If you've got the caring for the world without the connection to the liturgical, it devolves into social action. You're a social justice warrior, you're secularized. The great figures, and every one that we mentioned, I'll give you another one, by the way, Fulton J. Sheen. Read Sheen's early work, I love it, on ecclesiology. It's filled with this perspective. I learned it from him, probably. It's the first time I read all this stuff. But when you have both, now we're cooking. When you have both, you have a properly integrated vision. And the one will feed the other. It's like you set up this wonderful, mutually energizing connection between the two. And that's what, talk about Dorothy Day, someone else that knew that in her bones.
I do want to get to Dorothy Day, another hero of both of ours, but there's one person I want to talk about before that. His name is one you just mentioned a few moments ago, Monsignor Bill Quinn. So Monsignor Quinn was the link between you and Hillenbrand. Monsignor Quinn, I think, passed away in 2004, and you said at the time that except for your father, he was the greatest man you've ever known. He, in many ways, was shaped and marked by both the liturgy and the social concerns of the church. Tell us a little bit about Monsignor Quinn.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. He's not a household name, but in Chicago he would be. And a lot of the people I mentioned, at least on this side of the Atlantic, back in the day would have known Monsignor Quinn. I'll set it up this way. I'm 26 years old. I'm newly ordained priest. I'm sent to St. Paul the Cross Parish in Park Ridge, Illinois. If you've flown into O'Hare, you've flown right over it, right? And living at the rectory at the time was a newly retired priest named Bill Quinn, 70 years old, newly retired, and he was living in the rectory. So I'd run into him. I didn't know who he was from Adam. And we'd start talking, and he was wonderful, friendly and fascinating. And then he'd drop a name. I'd say, oh, did you know him? Oh, yeah. How'd you know him? Well, I think it was at Vatican II. You were at Vatican II? Yeah, I was living right down the hall from John Courtney Murray. John Courtney Murray? He said, yeah, I remember he was clacking away at his typewriter when he was writing Dignitatis Humanae. You were there when he was it was that kind of a thing where he would just kind of gradually unveil, his rather remarkable career. Well, as I mentioned, I think, a few minutes ago, Bill, ordained 1940, was one of the students of Reynold Hillenbrand, along with a whole coterie of Chicago priests. And he followed Hillenbrand faithfully. He would have been a Hillenbrand man. They called them Hilly's boys back in the day, these young priests that kind of followed Hillenbrand's. And what he got from him was so much. He got the artistic tradition of the church. Bill loved Chartres Cathedral. They got the intellectual tradition. He loved Aquinas and the church fathers. And he got the liturgical tradition, and he got the social justice tradition. All of it wrapped together in a very coherent package. Bill would have been thoroughly pre-Vatican II. I mean, born, I don't know what year, born in the 20s or late teens or something, ordained 1940. So the first 25 years of his priesthood is all pre-conciliar. But then he got the council. I mean, he understood, not the kind of kooky, crazy season after the council, but he understood where the council was coming from and saw that it embodied a lot of these themes. Well, it's one of the great graces of my life, really, that I was, because I didn't know him from Adam, but I think, God knew who he was. And God sent me there as this young, impressionable kid, but interested in all these things. And here was this great sort of guru figure, like a master figure. And Bill had a big impact on me. So a lot of my taking in of the tradition I've been describing came through his mediation.
Am I right in remembering that he also was very active in racial reconciliation work?
Yeah, he was pastor of a parish called St. Eulalia, still in Chicago. It's right off the Eisenhower Expressway. And so Bill would be pastor right when it was undergoing a sort of integration. So a lot of white folks were moving out, the Black and Hispanic folks are moving in. And Bill was a marvelous link. He was a marvelous figure that would bring these different groups together. He knew Cesar Chavez very well, by the way. In fact, Chavez, I think it was, did a reading at Bill's 25th anniversary mass. He knew Gustavo Gutierrez. He knew the liberation theologian people, from back in the 60s and 70s. Now, there we can keep the conversation going if you want. Were there parts of this tradition that kind of started getting unraveled? So as I mentioned liberation theology, I would share a lot of, let's say, Ratzinger's concerns about liberation theology. Did it begin with a good instinct but maybe get unraveled a bit? Okay, we can talk about that. But Bill, I think, would have taken in a lot of this beautifully integrated vision that we've been talking about. He knew Dorothy Day, too, by the way. He would have been in touch with her.
Well, let's move on. It's funny how all of these figures seem linked. You mentioned Cesar Chavez as well, who was also a friend of Dorothy Day. And that's where I wanted to go next, is to maybe wrap up this discussion with Dorothy, because to me, she stands out above and beyond all the figures of the 20th century as the preeminent example of the linking of the liturgical life of the church and the social action. She was arguably the loudest advocate for justice and peace, at least in the English-speaking world during the 20th century. Yet she was also very devoted and considerate of the liturgy. As a young woman, when she was being drawn from communism into Catholicism, and her social work was already in high gear at that point, it was the liturgy that began to captivate her. In fact, she describes this early experience of attending Mass and being impressed at how the rich and the poor were kneeling side by side in prayer. And she observed that this mixed community of rich and poor in the harsh world of 1930s America was something that you could hardly find anywhere else, yet it strangely existed there around the altar of Christ.
Yeah.
Why do you think this left such a deep impact on Dorothy Day, and how did it shape the rest of her work?
Well, as you say, that was the way in, I think, as she was. If you want to understand Dorothy Day, go get it's a marvelous movie called Reds, and it's about Jack Reed, who was a social activist, revolutionary in the 1910s and into the 1920s. Eugene O'Neill was part of that group. These Greenwich Village intellectuals, radicals, Max Eastman, for example, another one. Dorothy Day was part of that world. So she would have been, let's say, a 20-year-old in 1917, when Jack Reed is talking about the Russian Revolution, World War I's going on, all the social activism around that. So she was in that world. But then for a lot of reasons, you and I both know how compelling that story is. We can't tell the whole thing now, but she began to open her heart to something deeper, a spiritual dimension of life. And then she tried to find a way to link these two things together, her great commitment to justice and to the poor, and her newly found faith. And the transition moment, I think, was the liturgy, when she'd go to Mass. And as you say, she'd notice not a segregated world, but the very richest, the very poorest, the establishment types, the new immigrants, very well educated, very poorly educated, but all kneeling together, all looking toward the same thing together. The mystical body on display. That's what struck her, I think. Then the rest of her life, you might say, was an attempt, and Peter Morin, who was the co-founder with her of Catholic Worker Movement, played a huge role. By the way, there's another name. If you want to put in our sort of Hall of Fame of these people, read Peter Morin. He's all over this. Liturgical movement meets social justice, meets the mystical body. Peter Morin's another one. And Dorothy Day would have been schooled by him in this vision. But she beautifully exemplifies it, as you say. It's not just a theory, but she lived it. I don't know anyone in the Catholic world who was more radically committed to justice and the poor than Dorothy Day. And, I mean, with the exception maybe of a Trappist hermit or something, someone more dedicated to prayer, benediction, retreat, Mass, 40 hours, rosary, than Dorothy Day. She did both. And there she is indeed like Mother Teresa. That famous photo, we've all seen it now, when Mother Teresa met Dorothy Day. And Dorothy especially was very elderly at the time. Mother Teresa was probably in her 60s or something. And Mother Teresa has the habit on, and Dorothy Day is kind of like an old lady dress on. And there they are, these two great figures who embodied everything that we're talking about.
It's sometimes supposed that those who care about the social mission of the church are apathetic about the liturgy. But there's a Dorothy Day story that I really like, which belies this assumption. On one occasion, there was a priest who was celebrating Mass at one of her Catholic worker houses. And this is, I'm guessing, post-Vatican II, crazy
probably.
time, or maybe shortly before it. But he decided to use a ceramic coffee mug for the chalice, and then this plain old plate as the paten. And Dorothy, by accounts, grimaced when she saw the vessels, but she didn't complain. She indeed took part in the liturgy, received communion, and afterward even expressed gratitude to the priest for celebrating Mass. But then when everyone had gone, she took the cup and the plate and she had them buried outside. And she told the others that having held the body and blood of Christ, that the vessels should no longer be used for coffee. What do you think that story speaks in regards to this conversation?
And I remember that before she buried the cup, she had it broken. She broke it into pieces, and it just as kind of a sign of reverence, and that this could never return to profane usage. To me that speaks volumes, because I'm sure the priest thought he was being very cool and very post-conciliar, and I'm kind of with the people, but she didn't buy that, because that was a divorce then between the two dimensions. That was a lack of respect to the real presence. But without the real presence, then you don't have the church's authentic social commitment. It's from the liturgy that it comes. And so if you're flippant or blasé about the liturgy, then you will soon become just a secular social activist. To be honest, Brandon, that's what some people are concerned about with some of the Catholic worker houses around the country, that they've lost some of Dorothy's intense spiritual commitment and can devolve. I shouldn't speak because I don't really know every one, of course, but can devolve in that direction. She did not have that problem.
Let's close with this question. As a Catholic bishop, what's the path moving forward in these two areas? To use the title of one of your books, how do we bridge the great divide between the liturgy and social justice?
Deification. So I got Godfrey Diekman's cane. I can feel it come down on my knee right now. Deification, a recovery of the mystical body theology. Once you get that, you will automatically get both sides of it. Also, I would encourage communities, parishes, that practice both in a very enthusiastic way. That people in one group are also involved in the other and vice versa. So if the pastor of a parish in his role as shepherd should make sure those two groups are in contact with each other. But the key is the mystical body theology. It's deification.
Reminds me when you give your talks on faith and science and you say, can I have all the science teachers stand up and all the theology teachers stand up? Now you guys talk to each other. It's
Absolutely.
Like, can we have all the liturgy people up and all the social justice people and you guys talk to each other?
Yeah, and stop caricaturing. We do that all the time. So the social justice types will look at the liturgical people, oh, there they are fussing around with their cassocks. And then the liturgical people, oh, look at those, Marxist secularists over there. No, the link is the Eucharist and the mystical body.
Well, now it's time for our question from one of our listeners. Today we have one from Susan in New York. She's asking about an argument that persuaded Bishop Barron as a young man and set him on a new course of life. So here's Susan's question.
Hello, Bishop Barron. My name is Susan from New York. You mentioned in a recent homily that you were very persuaded about the existence of God when you were a freshman in high school. Can you please repeat that argument for us?
Yeah, thank you. It's the first way of Thomas Aquinas, the argument from motion. You want the quick version. Some things change. Whatever is changed by another. There can be no infinite regress in changed changers. Therefore, there must be some first unchanged changer, and this all people call God. That would be a very schematic presentation of the argument. It begins with this very ordinary experience of things changing. Thomas calls it motus or motion, but it doesn't mean just physical motion or change of place. He means any kind of change. Well, nothing changes itself. It can't change. It can't move itself from potency to act. It has to be actualized by something external. But then I can't have an infinite regress of moved movers. There's got to be a first uncaused cause or first unmoved mover. So it's a argument that's part of a whole family of arguments that are like that, argument for a first instance. Anyway, it struck me when I was a kid. It struck me when I first heard that as very compelling and interesting and set me on this path of discovery that I've never left. And I spent a lot of my life, writing about that argument, teaching it, defending it. So it played a big role in my life.
Susan, if you'd like a more detailed elaboration of the argument, check out Bishop's book on Thomas Aquinas, but also the work of Edward Fazer. He has a great book called Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide that goes through each of the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas. Well, as we wrap up today, I am excited to announce not just the newest book at Word on Fire, but the newest series of books at Word on Fire. Look at this big boxed set from those of you watching on YouTube. This is a 4-volume series of books by Peter Kreeft titled Socrates' Children, An Introduction to Philosophy from the 100 Greatest Philosophers. Peter Kreeft, the esteemed philosophy professor, author of over 80 books, has taught college philosophy for 60 years. And throughout those decades, he said he yearned for a beginner's philosophy text that was clear, accessible, enjoyable, and exciting, perhaps even funny. And finding none that met those criteria, he decided to write it himself, as Peter is wont to do. In this 4-volume set, he delivers with his characteristic wit and clarity an introduction to philosophy. So if you've always wanted to learn philosophy, this is a great way in. It examines the key ideas and players in 4 major eras, ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary, and immerses readers in the great conversation, the ongoing dialogue among the greatest thinkers of history. So check it out. It's the most exciting new release from Word on Fire. Again, it's called Socrates' Children, an introduction to philosophy from the 100 greatest philosophers. And as always, I will include a link in the show notes. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.